There is a version of the 41st millennium where none of this exists. No golden throne, no astronomicon, no space marine chapters, no inquisition, no ecclesiarchy, none of the 10,000 institutions that make the Imperium what it is, just wreckage and silence and whatever came after humanity to pick through the bones of a civilization that reached the stars and then ran out of road. That version almost happened. 5 times. Not almost in the way people use the word when they mean things were hard. Almost in the way that matters, where the forces arrayed against the Imperium were genuinely sufficient to end it. Where the math said one thing and history somehow produced another. Where, if you run the numbers honestly on any of these 5 moments, the Imperium should not have survived. And yet here it stands, broken, brutal, burning on 100,000 fronts simultaneously, held together by the faith of billions who mostly don't understand what they're propping up, but standing. This video is not about the victories. Anyone can catalog victories. This is about the margins, the specific uncomfortable texture of how close each failure actually was, what it cost to close each gap, and what all 5 moments together reveal about what this institution really is, underneath the cathedral architecture and the 10,000 years of accumulated mythology. Because the honest answer doesn't start with glory. It starts with the people who chose to be in the way. Chapter 1. The Siege of Terra. Love was the weakness that nearly ended everything. Most accounts of the siege start with the battle. The orbital bombardment, the drop pod landings, the traitor legions grinding through months of prepared Imperial defenses. I want to start with the conditions, because the final hours don't make sense without them. 9 years of civil war had preceded the siege. 9 years during which half the Space Marine legions turned against the Emperor, during which the 1,000 Suns were remade into hollow sorcerous automata after the destruction of Prospero, during which the Death Guard embraced Nurgle's rot and the Emperor's children dissolved into sensation until they had forgotten their own purpose, during which the word-bearers had been tearing holes in reality and pushing demon legions through for the entire war, during which the world-eaters had slowly lost every part of themselves that could still be called human. 9 years, and then the fleets arrived at Terra, and the siege did not begin with the gate. It began months earlier, with the outer defenses, the traitor host outside the palace walls, numbered in the billions, not just space marines, but cultists, mutants, daemon engines, titan legions walking under chaos banners, the full accumulated weight of everything Horus had gathered across 9 years of burning half the Imperium. The defenders threw everything they had at every breach, and barely held each one. Each day bought was another day. The loyalist reinforcements hadn't arrived. Each day lost was ground that could not be recovered. 3 legions held the palace. The Imperial Fists under Rogal Dorn, who had spent those 9 years doing the one thing he was born for, turning the Imperial Palace into the most fortified structure in human history. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius, the White Scars under Jagatai Khan, whose entire genius was built around movement and speed, and never fighting the battle the enemy wanted. Now trapped in the one type of warfare he had spent his career demonstrating was the wrong way to fight. Behind them, the Custodian Guard, the Sisters of Silence, billions of mortal soldiers who were, To be precise about it, dying faster than they were winning. 3 times the traitor forces scaled the outer walls. 3 times Sanguinius and his blood angels hurled them back. But the outer ring was collapsing anyway. The Eternity Wall spaceport fell. The Lion's Gate spaceport fell. Traitor titans walked on the soil of the Palace Plateau. Horus ordered his forces to take the Eternity Gate at dawn, the last physical door between the traitor host and the Emperor's throne room. If it fell, the Emperor was within reach. About 70,000 loyalists mustered on the Delphic battlement. Sanguinius organized them. A corrupted Reaver Titan had broadcast Horus's surrender terms to the defenders. Sanguinius flew up and beheaded it. That set the tone. Then Kabanda arrived. The same bloodthirster Sanguinius had fought at Cygnus Prime, the demon he had already beaten once, already taken serious wounds from, who came back looking for the kill he had been denied. Sanguinius grabbed it by the ankle and arm, broke its spine over his knee, hurled the carcass back into the host, pressing against the door, and slammed the gate shut on the tide. He bought those hours on a body that should have been grounded weeks earlier. Then Angron came, directed by Horus personally, the daemon primarch of the World Eaters, sent to kill the angel. Angron impaled Sanguinius on the black blade. Sanguinius, with his last remaining strength, reached up and tore the butcher's nails from Angron's skull, banishing the daemon primarch back to the warp. Even dying, the angel took a demon with him on the way out. Hours after the gate closed, Horus lowered the void shields on the vengeful spirit. This is the moment everyone focuses on. The duel, the sacrifice, the Emperor's broken body. The more important question is what happened in the hours between the gate closing and Horus dropping his shields. What happened was that Horus ran the numbers and understood he was losing. The Ultramarines were days away. The Space Wolves were close behind. Rogel Dorn was still in the fight, the loyalist position, against all odds and all reasonable projection, had held. Horus was running out of time to win through siege warfare. The window was closing. He opened himself to the Emperor as a challenge. Come and face me directly, or watch your palace fall before help arrives. Sanguinius had confronted the Emperor while he was fitting on his armor for the teleport assault. He refused to stay behind. He revealed his prophetic visions, the ones he had been carrying for years, the ones that always ended the same way, and said he did not seek that death, but intended to challenge it by going to face it directly. The Emperor changed his mind. He allowed Sanguinius to come. He knew. He had known for years. He went in anyway. On the vengeful spirit, the teleport scattered them. Sanguinius reached Horus first, alone, carrying wounds from Kabanda and Angron, carrying the exhaustion of the gate's defense, carrying the foreknowledge of exactly how this ended. Horus was carrying the combined investment of all 4 Chaos Gods simultaneously. The outcome was predetermined by every variable in play. Sanguinius fought anyway, not because he thought he could win, because every second Horus spent killing him was a second the Emperor needed. He traded his life for time. The crack his resistance left in Horus's defenses was the opening the Emperor later exploited. He went in to make the crack, and he made it. And then Horus killed him. The Imperium built cathedrals, named him a saint. his face carved above Blood Angel Chapel doors on 1,000 worlds. None of those monuments say that he walked in with full knowledge of the outcome and chose it anyway. Not from faith, from calculation. The calculation that his death was the most useful thing he had to offer at that specific moment. That is a harder truth than the official version. It is also a more impressive one. The official version requires Sanguinius to be a figure of divine acceptance, serenely meeting a foreordained fate because the universe or the emperor required it. That is the easier story. It is also the lesser one. The real version is a person who looked at the numbers, understood the exchange rate, and paid it anyway, because that was what the situation required. That is not a saint's story. That is a soldier's story, and it is a truer tribute to what he was. The psychic shockwave of Sanguinius's death hit every blood angel on the surface of Terra simultaneously. They broke, not in the way soldiers break under fire, but in the way that grief breaks through every layer of psychological conditioning that a lifetime of chapter training builds. The black rage took them all at once, the first mass manifestation in history. 2,000 blood angels consumed by visions of their Primarch's final moments, fighting as if they were him, unstoppable and uncontrollable, crashing into the traitor line at the exact moment the loyalist position was about to give way. A genetic curse was the tactical factor that held the last line. Let that sit. The thing that saved humanity's home world at its most desperate hour was not a weapon, not a tactical genius making the right call, not a Primarch arriving in time. It was a psychic wound inflicted on a legion by the death of their father, spontaneously producing the berserk fury that the traitor advance could not withstand. Every blood angel who has lost himself to the black rage in 10,000 years since, every Death Company warrior who woke to find visions of Sanguinius's dying moments consuming everything he once was, is paying a debt incurred at the Eternity Gate. The Imperium has never acknowledged this debt. It has never found the language. The ledger has never been written, because writing it would mean acknowledging exactly how close the throne room came to falling, and at what price it was kept from falling, and that the currency paid was a legion's genetic inheritance drawn down in suffering across every generation since. Now the Emperor was alone with Horus on the vengeful spirit. Here is the part that matters most and gets examined least. The Emperor held back. He still loved Horus. He looked at the thing wearing his son's face, the thing that had burned the galaxy for 9 years, that had just killed Sanguinius in front of him, and he still could not fully accept that his son was gone. He let Horus break his back, destroy his eye, crack his armor open, and push him to the actual threshold of death. My position on this stated clearly that hesitation was not weakness. It was the truest thing about the Emperor, a being who had made cold utilitarian calculations for 10,000 years without apparent emotional cost, finally encountering the one variable he had never built a framework for. He had not let himself feel the full weight of what the heresy had taken from him. He tried to feel it all in that duel. It nearly killed him. What broke the hesitation was the smallest possible thing. Horus killed a mortal crew member. Casually. A reflex of contempt that served no tactical purpose, and that meaningless cruelty confirmed what the evidence had been saying for 9 years. Nothing of his son remained. The Emperor stopped holding back. Horus was unmade in the same instant. The price was the golden throne. The price was the emperor's body reduced to a state where only the most extraordinary psychic life support machine ever built could maintain biological function. About 1,000 psychers are consumed every single day just to keep the Astronomicon burning. The beacon that allows every ship in the Imperium to navigate through the warp. Without it, there is no interstellar travel, no communication, no Imperium at civilizational scale. 1,000 human lives, every day, for 10,000 years. The Imperium maintains entire institutions to collect those psychers and feed them into the machine. The black ships come, and some people go, and they burn, and the light stays on. That is the recurring cost the siege put on the table. Not a one-time sacrifice, a daily one, compounding for 10 millennia. The emperor had spent his entire existence fighting against being worshipped. When Lorgar built temples and wrote scripture in his name, the emperor made the word-bearers tear down everything they had raised as punishment. He suppressed religion across the Imperium because worship fed the warp, and the warp was the enemy. He told Lorgar this directly. He was not ambiguous, not subtle, not leaving room for interpretation. What he got was the largest religion in human history, built around his ruined body. 1 billion people praying to something that cannot answer. Billions more finding courage in that faith, finding meaning in it, finding the will to keep fighting one more day because of it. The faith works. In a narrow, functional, purely consequentialist sense, it keeps the Imperium coherent across distances that would otherwise make coordinated civilization impossible. It binds 1,000,000 worlds together. It gives billions of human beings a reason to endure conditions that would otherwise produce collapse. It works. It just doesn't work the way the Emperor would have chosen. It works by being precisely the thing he spent his life fighting against. The institution that has preserved humanity across 10,000 years of war is built on the explicit rejection of its founder's core purpose. The god of a religious empire that despised religion. The savior of a theocracy he tried to prevent from ever existing. There is no resolution to that contradiction. The Imperium just lives in it. He's on the throne. He cannot tell them to stop. They won the siege. The version of the Imperium the siege was being fought to protect died in the same moment as the victory. Chapter 2. The War of the Beast, Last Man Standing, and the institutions born from nothing. The mid-32nd millennium was supposed to be calm. 1,000 years had passed since the siege. The time of rebirth had stabilized the post-heresy institutions. The traitor legions were locked behind the Eye of Terror. The High Lords of Terra occupied themselves with exactly the kind of elaborate political maneuvering that only flourishes when there is no genuine emergency to force actual decisions. The beast ended the peace. It started with a silence. The Imperial Fist's shield company deployed to the world of Ardamantua went quiet. The rescue fleet arrived and found gravitational anomalies of a scale that had no precedent in recorded Imperial history. And then the source of those anomalies materialized. An artificial construct the size of a small moon, emerging from a form of subspace transit, generated by pure raw, psychic energy. An attack moon, not a rock, not an asteroid fortress, a purpose-built military installation of planetoid scale, armed with a gravity whip that tore capital ships apart at range, crewed by Orc forces in numbers that dwarfed every previous incursion since the Ullanor campaign the Emperor himself had led. The Imperial fists were annihilated at Ardamantua. There were 4 survivors of the entire chapter. 3 died while being treated by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests. 1 remained. Second, Captain Kurland, wall name Slaughter, de facto chapter master of a chapter that no longer existed. He carried the report back to Terra. Attack moons were appearing across Segmentum Solar. Entire star systems were going dark. The Orc forces deploying from the moons were coordinated, directed with strategic sophistication that Orcs had never previously demonstrated, by something the Orcs themselves treated with reverence bordering on religious awe. The Beast, the High Lords of Terra, responded to the largest Orc invasion in human history with politics. Grand Admiral Lansung gathered his fleet at the Glaucasian Gulf. The positioning served his personal ambitions and kept the Imperial Navy away from the fight. Other High Lords argued about precedent and authority. Multiple members of the most powerful governing body in human history spent their time calculating their individual institutional positions while billions died per day in star systems that simply ceased to respond. The gravitational and psychic storms generated by WOG energy spread further than the moons themselves, driving populations to madness and disrupting astropathic communication at the worst possible moment. Cults venerating the beast as divine began appearing on worlds that should have been fortifying their defenses. An attack moon appeared over Terra, an Orc fortress the size of a small moon, with weapons capable of dismantling the Imperium's largest warships, hung in orbit above humanity's home world, while the people responsible for protecting humanity continued arguing about who had authority over what. Kurland saw both crises clearly. The external one was the beast. The internal one was the governing structure of the Imperium itself, which had demonstrated in real time that it was incapable of coordinated response to an extinction-level threat. He was the last Imperial fist, which meant he had nothing left to protect institutionally. No chapter autonomy to guard, no political position worth calculating, the peculiar freedom of having already lost everything. He invoked the Last Wall Protocol, the contingency Rogold Dorn had built into his son's genetic and cultural inheritance, the instruction that if Terra was ever directly threatened, all successor chapters of the Imperial Fist's Legion would reform as one. He eventually maneuvered himself into becoming Lord Commander of the Imperium itself, ousting the Lord Commander whose incompetence was costing billions of lives per day, doing it not through military force but through the specific political leverage that came from being the last son of Dorn. He weaponized his own tragedy, turned the annihilation of his chapter into the credential no one could contest. The Death Watch was Kurland's invention. It did not exist before this war. He created it because standard doctrine, overwhelming force applied through established tactical templates, kept failing. The beast was learning from every engagement, adapting faster than Imperial doctrine could respond. Throwing more Space Marines at the same approaches that had already failed was not a solution. It was a slower version of defeat. What was needed was precision rather than scale. Small teams, cross-chapter, combining expertise that no single chapter possessed, capable of the decapitation strike that was the only realistic way to end a WOG, led by something this intelligent. Warriors from different chapters, trained differently, thinking differently, covering each other's tactical gaps in ways that mono-chapter formations could not. He brought back the Sisters of Silence from their exile, psychic nulls whose presence degraded the WOG energy that powered the attack moon's most dangerous capabilities. Their presence was not decisive alone, but it was the necessary condition for the decisive thing to work. You could not reach the beast through the psychic storm the WOG generated without something that could dampen that storm. Corland understood this when most of the Imperium's military thinkers were still asking how to build bigger guns. 4 separate assaults on Ulanor. Vulcan, a Primarch returned specifically for this crisis, sacrificed himself on the 3rd. The Imperial forces withdrew, believing the war won. The beast had survived. Ulanor was still active. The kill that finally worked was a Deathwatch kill team teleporting directly into the beast's throne room and murdering him in his sanctum. Not a siege. Not an orbital bombardment. A small team of exceptional warriors delivered to the exact location of the problem, shielded from psychic interference by the Sisters of Silence. The beast's death collapsed the unified WOG consciousness. The Orc forces dissolved back into the leaderless mob behavior that defined them, without a singular dominant will directing them. The Death Watch and the Ordo Xenos both survive today as direct institutional legacy of this war. They are the Imperium admitting, in institutional form, that some threats require a fundamentally different approach than the standard playbook provides. The lesson was written in 30,000 Space Marine deaths and the near annihilation of Terra. That is the standard rate for learning in this setting. The epilogue is darker than the war. Drakan Vangorich, the one High Lord who had actually performed his function throughout the crisis, watched the Senatorum return to its pre-war behavior within months of the beast's death. The political paralysis that had cost billions of lives reasserted itself, as if the war had never happened. He concluded, not irrationally, that an institution capable of this failure could not be trusted to survive the next one. He had the entire High Council killed in a single day. All of them, simultaneously. He installed puppets and ruled through them for nearly a standard century. He was right about the problem. He was catastrophically wrong about the solution. Removing the people does not fix the architecture that keeps producing those people. His puppets develop the same pathologies as the originals, the same power games, the same prioritization of personal position over imperial survival. Van Gorich spent a century watching his solution fail, went mad from the isolation of absolute power, and had to be removed by Space Marines. The new High Lords went back to their old habits. The pattern always reasserts, not because the individuals are uniquely corrupt, because the structure produces the behavior, and the structure persisted. 3. The Rain of Blood. The machine turned against itself. Every other crisis on this list came from outside. Chaos. Orcs. Structural dysfunction that is impersonal and endemic. The kind that accumulates when no one is specifically malicious, just specifically self-interested. This one is different. This is what the Imperium looks like when one man acquires the right institutional levers and turns the entire apparatus of human civilization inward, against itself, And the most disturbing thing about it is how ordinary the mechanism was. Vandir did not invent a new method of seizing power. He used the existing structures for what they were already designed to do. He just aimed them at the wrong targets. Goj Vandir was master of the administratum, the head of the organization through which all imperial governance practically flowed. He then maneuvered himself into the ecclesiarch's seat simultaneously. One man, both positions, the head of secular administration and the head of the state church. One man. Every lever, no effective counterbalance remaining. The trap was self-sealing from the moment he closed it. He wielded the Frateris Templar, billions of religious soldiers who believed completely they were serving the Emperor's will, against anyone who challenged his authority. Not heretics, not aliens, imperial citizens who were slow on their tithes, governors whose loyalty he questioned, entire sectors where the population had murmured in the wrong direction. Every death filed as suppression of heresy, because Vandir controlled both the definition of heresy and the instruments for enforcing it. There was no internal mechanism for challenging him that didn't require his own authorization. The trap was self-sealing from the moment he closed it, and everyone who might have challenged him early, when the cost would have been manageable, had already calculated that it was too expensive. By the time the cost of inaction was obvious to everyone, Vandir had been killing for decades and had already eliminated the people who could have opposed him effectively. He did not corrupt the Imperium's institutions. He used them, exactly as designed, for the wrong purpose. That is what makes the Reign of Blood sit differently from the other crises on this list. The weapons were functioning correctly. They were pointed inward. 70 years. Billions dead. The ecclesiarchal palace itself fell into physical decay because no one dared enter Vandir's presence without specific summons. His paranoid outbursts had become too unpredictable for proximity to be safe, even for allies. While the seat of the Imperium's religious power crumbled, Vandir directed resources toward building kilometer-high cathedrals on distant worlds, monuments to the Emperor's glory that were also, visibly, monuments to Vandir San Sebastian Thor, emerged from Dimamar, a preacher, not a space marine, not a primarch, not a scion of any powerful house or faction, a man with the gift of speaking truth in a way that made people willing to die for it, which in the Imperium is a rarer quality than combat effectiveness. Vandir dispatched the Frateris Templar to reduce Dimamar to ash and kill everything on it. The fleet entered the warp and did not arrive. A storm of extraordinary violence consumed it in transit. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon sent to end one preacher's inconvenient message. The storm that destroyed them is called the storm of the Emperor's wrath. Whether that is divine intervention or the most perfectly timed coincidence in imperial history depends on your theology. The practical effect was identical regardless. Vandir had tried to eliminate a reform movement and created its founding miracle instead. The Confederation of Light grew from one world to 80 in months. Space Marine chapters declared for Thor. The Adeptus Mechanicus aligned with the Reformers. The Imperial Navy began fracturing. By the time the crusade reached Terra, Thor commanded 5 million soldiers and the support of every major Imperial institution except the ones Vandir still directly controlled. The end came from inside Vandir's own sanctum. The Adeptus Custodes, arranged for the brides of the Emperor, Vandyr's personal bodyguard. The warrior women he had subverted through manipulation and what sources describe as a conversion field that made him appear divinely protected, to be taken before the Emperor's actual presence. Whatever they experienced before the Golden Throne, the lore does not fully describe. What it says is that they came back changed. Alicia Dominica drew her power sword. Vandyr's last words: "I don't have time to die. I'm too busy." The Adepta Sororitas was born from that moment. The decree passive followed, the ecclesiarchy forever forbidden from maintaining men under arms. A provision specifically worded to prevent any future consolidation of religious and military power in the same hands. The loophole for women under arms was not an oversight. Sebastian Thor wrote it deliberately, creating the Sisters of Battle as the ecclesiarchy's military force. Subject to the Ordo Hereticus, a new Inquisition division created specifically to police the Imperium's internal organs against future Vandiers. Those solutions were genuine, targeted, addressing the specific failure modes that had allowed the Reign of Blood to happen. The Ordo Hereticus exists today. The decree passive exists today. No one has replicated Vandyr's specific approach in the 10,000 years since Thor ended it. My position on the Reign of Blood stated directly: this is not primarily a story about a mad tyrant. Mad tyrants are common. They appear across every human civilization with enough regularity to be treated as structural features rather than anomalies. This is a story about an institution whose checks and balances depended entirely on the people holding key positions being willing to use them, and those people calculating the personal cost of opposition, while the cost of inaction climbed into the billions of dead. By the time the cost of inaction was obvious to everyone, Vandir had been killing people for decades. The architecture adapted to block that specific failure mode. It has not yet learned to anticipate the next one. It never does. That is the pattern that connects all 5 entries on this list. And the Reign of Blood makes it clearest because the solution was so deliberately constructed and so specific. And because it still failed to address the underlying problem, which is that any institution that depends on the personal ethics of the people inside it to function correctly will eventually put the wrong people inside it. Chapter 4: The Nova Terra Interregnum. 900 years of not quite dying. This entry does not have a hero moment, no final stand, no last survivor, no preacher walking toward an empire. This is what it looks like when the Imperium starts dissolving from within, not in a single catastrophe, but through the slow accumulation of damage across nearly a millennium that should, by any rational projection, have been sufficient to kill it as a coherent entity. In the mid-34th millennium, the Council of Nova Terra dismissed the authority of the High Lords of Terra and claimed sovereignty over the Segmentum Pacificus. Not a minor rebellion. The Segmentum Pacificus is a significant fraction of imperial territory, population, industrial output, and military force. The Council had the resources to make this stick. What followed lasted 900 years. 2 human empires, born from the same heritage, spending nearly a millennium bleeding each other. Every Space Marine chapter with operations in contested territory, drawn into a conflict that should have been impossible within an Imperium theoretically unified under the High. Lords, the Adeptus Mechanicus simultaneously fractured in the Moirai Schism, a theological dispute about whether future events could be read in fluctuations of the Astronomican signal, which split Forge worlds along doctrinal lines and introduced violent civil conflict into the one institution whose stability was non-negotiable for the Imperium's military capacity. Think about what it means for the Adeptus Mechanicus to be at war with itself. Weapons production disrupted by factional allegiance. Ship repairs refused based on which side a vessel belonged to. The intricate web of technical dependence that ties Forge worlds to client systems unraveling because technical expertise became a political weapon. The Imperium's military machine runs on Mechanicus industrial output. For much of the Interregnum, the Mechanicus was directing significant energy toward destroying portions of itself. While the Civil War bled both halves of the Imperium and the Mechanicus tore itself apart, every alien species that had been held at bay by a unified imperial response began probing the gaps created by that fragmentation. Orcs pushed into systems that had been too well defended to raid under normal conditions. The Dark Eldar increased their operations because defense coordination had collapsed. Threats the Imperium had been managing through sheer coordinated weight began advancing in the absence of that coordination. The borders were not collapsing visibly. They were leaking, slowly, quietly, in dozens of places at once that no individual authority could track or respond to. And none of this made headlines. None of it produced a single famous battle or a single famous name. It just happened. 900 years of it just happening. Then something came out of the Ghoul Stars. The Ghoul Stars appear in Imperial records as a defined absence, a region identified by what has been suppressed, rather than by what is known. During the late 34th millennium, something the surviving fragments call the Pale Wasting emerged from that darkness. Part plague, part mechanical horror, it swept through Imperial worlds. 11 Space Marine chapters were destroyed as coherent military organizations. Gone entirely, the 13th Space Marine founding was initiated in direct response. The Death Spectres chapter was created and stationed permanently at the Ghoul Star's border as a containment measure for whatever the Pale Wasting represented. An entire chapter, 10 companies of Space Marines, in permanent vigil as a wall between the threat and everyone behind them. That is not victory. That is the Imperium acknowledging it cannot eliminate the threat and stationing someone to absorb it indefinitely. The Interregnum ended not through military victory, but through exhaustion. 900 years of fighting consumed more than either side could sustain. An uneasy stalemate was formalized. The ecclesiarchy, operating across both empires as a religious force that didn't acknowledge the political division as meaningful, used the moment to reconstitute the Imperium as an explicitly theocratic state. The cataclysm of souls that closed the Interregnum was violent enough that contemporary sources compared it to the Horus heresy in intensity, if not in scale. A unified Imperium came out the other side, weaker than when it split, carrying wounds that had accumulated for 900 years without treatment, and immediately entering the conditions for the reign of blood, because the ecclesiarchy's consolidated power as the force that had ended the Interregnum was exactly the architecture Van Deer would exploit within a few centuries. Here is the pattern that this entry makes most visible, because there is no hero to distract from it. Each crisis plants the seeds of the next one. The Codex Astartes, written after the heresy to prevent another Horus, limited legion strength and created the conditions that nearly made the War of the Beast fatal. The High Lords, created after the heresy to distribute power, were the dysfunctional institution that nearly let the beast win through paralysis. The ecclesiarchy, empowered through the cataclysm of souls, gave Vandire his vehicle. The Ordo Hereticus, created to prevent another Vandir, has its own vulnerabilities that sufficiently motivated individuals have found and exploited in the millennia since. The Imperium does not solve problems. It survives them, builds new structures in the wreckage, and those structures fail in new ways. This is not cynicism. This is what the evidence shows when you examine 10,000 years of institutional history without wanting it to mean something more reassuring. The Nova Terra Interregnum is where this pattern is most visible. No hero, just 900 years of bleeding, followed by exhausted reunion, followed by the seeds of the next catastrophe planted before the soil had settled. Chapter 5, The Fall of Cadia. The dam finally breaks. Everything before this entry is the Imperium surviving. Cadia did not. Every other crisis on this list ends with the Imperium still standing, damaged, permanently scarred, worse off than before, but present. The fall of Cadia ends with the thing that held for 10,000 years gone. The Eye of Terror unchained for the first time since the Necrons built their containment network 65 million years ago, and the galaxy split permanently in two. The Imperium survived the fall of Cadia. Everything the fall of Cadia was supposed to prevent did not survive it. Cadia was a fortress world at the Cadian Gate, the one reliable corridor out of the Eye of Terror. Children on Cadia learned to field strip a lasgun before they could read. An entire planetary culture built around one purpose: hold the gate. The Cadian Pylon Network, thousands of ancient Necron-built structures scattered across the planet's surface, each one standing 500 meters high and sunk 250 meters into the ground, had been suppressing the Eye of Terror's natural tendency to expand since before humanity existed as a spacefaring species. 65 million years of containment, the arrangement held through 12 Black Crusades. Most people understand Abaddon as a figure who keeps trying and failing. This is one of the most persistent misreadings in the entire setting. Each Black Crusade achieved specific objectives. Each one tested a different aspect of Cadian and Imperial defensive doctrine, eliminated specific assets, positioned specific resources for future use. The 12th Crusade, the Gothic War, was about acquiring Blackstone fortresses, not deploying them immediately. Acquiring them because Abaddon already knew what the 13th Crusade would require and was building the toolkit decades in advance. 10,000 years of preparation. One execution window. Let me be specific about what 10,000 years of preparation means in practice. Abaddon took control of the Black Legion from the ruins of the Sons of Horus after the siege. He spent the centuries that followed rebuilding it, recruiting from every traitor legion, turning what had been Horus's personal force into a coalition of the willing, the most powerful chaos military organization in the Eye of Terror. Each Black Crusade after that was a campaign with specific objectives that were achieved even when the crusade appeared to fail overall. The first Black Crusade spread chaos corruption throughout the Cadian sector and established chaos influence in ways that would be built on for millennia. The fourth secured territory and tested the response time of Imperial reinforcement. The seventh, ninth, 10th, 11th all had specific targets, specific objectives, specific pieces of the eventual 13th puzzle that they advanced. The 12th, the Gothic War, was about the Blackstone fortresses. Abaddon spent the Gothic War fighting for control of these ancient structures, these weapons of enormous power that could amplify warp energy or suppress it, depending on their configuration. He did not deploy them at Cadia during that war. He held them because he already knew what the 13th Crusade would require. That is, 10,000 years of patience, of maintaining purpose across a span of time longer than most human civilizations have ever existed, of keeping the endgame in view across 100 intermediate steps. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years celebrating that each individual Black Crusade was driven back. Abaddon spent 10,000 years ensuring each one moved the pieces closer to where he needed them. The 13th Black Crusade's objective was not the conquest of Cadia. It was the destruction of the pylons network. Without the pylons, the eye expands. An expanding eye means a permanent warp storm of galaxy-spanning scale. A permanent galaxy-spanning warp storm means no reliable navigation, no astropathic communication, no coordinated Imperium. Abaddon was not trying to conquer humanity. He was trying to remove the conditions that made human civilization possible at this scale. Archmagos Belisarius Call, a tech priest who had been quietly working on a specific project for 10,000 years, since Guilliman himself had commissioned it in secret after the heresy, reached Cadia during the 13th Crusade, with the aid of the Necron Lord Trazine the Infinite, who had been present when the pylons were first built 65 million years ago, and who decided that a warp-consumed galaxy served none of his interests. Call finally decoded what the pylons were for. Not just suppression, amplification, and full closure. He activated the full network at maximum capacity, and the Eye of Terror began to contract. Actually, observably, measurably contract. The wound that had defined the Imperium's existential situation since the heresy was being sealed. Call, at the culmination of 10,000 years of work, was accomplishing something that no one in the Imperium had believed was still possible. Humanity was winning. Abaddon used the damaged bulk of the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity as a kinetic impactor, a weapon the size of a space fortress, dropped from orbit onto the coordinates of maximum pylon concentration. The impact destroyed the network. The eye began to expand. He traded a Blackstone fortress, one of the most powerful weapons in the galaxy, an artifact he had spent the Gothic War acquiring specifically for this purpose, for the permanent elimination of the only proven method for sealing warp rifts at civilizational scale. He had held that weapon since the Gothic War, waiting for exactly this moment. The Cicatrix Maledictum tore open, the Great Rift, a permanent wound running across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly on the far side. The Imperium split in two. One half kept Terra, kept the Astronomicon, kept the functional governance infrastructure. The other half, Imperium Nihilis, was cut off from all of it. Worlds in Nihilus experienced temporal distortions, so severe that some aged centuries in moments, others froze entirely. Astropathic communication across the rift became nearly impossible. The coordination infrastructure that held a million-world empire together dissolved from one side of the galaxy. At the start of the 13th Black Crusade, Cadia had been home to around 850 million souls. When the evacuation was complete, scarcely 3 million were fleeing the system. The world itself was consumed by the warp within hours of the pylon's destruction. Lord Castellan Usurkar Creed, the military genius who had held Cadia's defenders together throughout the catastrophe, disappeared during the fall. Trazine the Infinite has since claimed to have him preserved. Whether that is rescue or something indistinguishable from captivity, the lore leaves deliberately open. The Imperium survived the fall of Cadia only because the cascading failures didn't quite reach terminal velocity before Guilliman was resurrected and the Indomitus Crusade launched. Baal was saved at the devastation of Baal, at costs covered on this channel in detail. The Primaris Space Marines were deployed. The Seraphon Ultima pushed back enough of the immediate post-Rift chaos to keep the Sanctus side functional. Survived, not repaired. The Rift is open. Nihilus is dark. Commander Dante runs half the galaxy as Lord Regent, not because anyone has a plan for governing a regent, permanently cut off from its own infrastructure, but because Dante is the best available person, and pointing the best available person at the worst available problem is the only governance philosophy the Imperium has ever possessed. The ratchet clicks forward. The Siege of Terra cost the Emperor. The War of the Beast cost the Imperial Fists, and 11 chapters to the Pale Wasting. The Reign of Blood cost 70 years and billions of lives. The Nova Terra Interregnum cost 900 years, and the Adeptus Mechanicus's coherence across a segmentum. The Fall of Cadia cost the Eye's permanent containment. A fortress world, half the functional galaxy, and any possibility of ever actually sealing the original wound. Each click, never once in 10,000 years does the ratchet reverse. Look at all 5 chapters together. The Imperium has not defeated any of these threats completely. Chaos is larger and freer now than before the rift. The orcs who produced the beast still exist, still grow, still wait for the next dominant will to unify them into something worse. The dysfunction that made the Reign of Blood possible is architectural rather than personal. Vandir is dead. The conditions that produce Vandirs are embedded in the design. The rift is open. The Tyranids approach from outside the galaxy with the patience of pure hunger. The Necrons wake across thousands of tomb worlds that slept for 60 million years. 5 times, the Imperium survived the immediate crisis with just enough left to generate the next one. Here is the thing that doesn't get said directly enough. The Imperium was never a well-functioning machine that got damaged. It was always this broken. The Emperor built something remarkable, and the heresy cracked it open before it was finished. Every institution that followed has been operating inside the ruins, maintaining the appearance of an empire through a combination of genuine heroism and spectacular institutional failure in roughly equal measure. The dysfunction was not introduced later. It was always there, embedded in the architecture, waiting for the right stress to expose it. Each of these 5 moments required something the Imperium's ordinary operational systems could not produce. The siege required a Primarch willing to die with his eyes open, and an emperor finally willing to stop loving what had become unlovable. The War of the Beast required the last survivor of a destroyed chapter to invent new institutions under fire, rather than accept the situation as terminal. The Reign of Blood required a preacher from a world no one had heard of to walk toward the most powerful man alive, with nothing but words and a warp storm with perfect timing. The Interregnum required 900 years of mutual exhaustion before either side could accept that reunion was less terrible than continuation. The Fall of Cadia required a returned Primarch, an alliance with an ancient Necron collector, and the permanent sacrifice of the last structure proven to close warp rifts. And even then, the rift still opened. Not one of those things was available within the system as designed. Everyone came from outside it, from individuals the system produced despite itself, rather than because of itself. The Imperium did not generate solutions to these crises. It generated pressure. The pressure produced people who generated solutions. That distinction matters because it tells you something true about what kind of institution the Imperium actually is. Not a machine that produces the right output when you input the right conditions, but a furnace that occasionally, under sufficient pressure, produces something extraordinary from its own wreckage. That is the honest accounting. The Imperium's survival mechanism is not its institutions. Those fail reliably, in structurally predictable ways. The survival mechanism is the specific human or transhuman capacity to refuse the outcome the mathematics says is settled, to look at the edge and decide, not here, not today. Sanguinius going to his death on the vengeful spirit, knowing exactly what waited. Kurlan choosing to build something new from nothing, rather than be the last relic of something gone. Thor walking, the unnamed Astartes, going into the ghoul stars after 11 chapters before them had gone in and not come out. Creed holding the walls while the planet tore apart beneath his feet. This is not clean heroism. Clean heroism wins. This is something harder and more true. People who understand the full weight of the price, paying it anyway, not because they believe it will be enough, but because someone has to be the reason it doesn't end here. Buying time, buying it at prices that would be called tragedies in any other setting. The Imperium stands. It has never been whole. It has been surviving not whole since the siege, every single day for 10,000 years, holding the shape of something that was never finished being built. It stands anyway, held up by hands that knew what they were reaching for when they reached, and by the stubborn refusal of specific people at specific moments to accept the outcome the situation demanded. The margin has been getting smaller each time. The ratchet says so clearly. The Tyranids are still coming from outside the galaxy. The Necrons are waking. The rift is open, and what lives in the warp is coming through it in ways it couldn't before Cadia fell. The Imperium facing all of this is simultaneously the weakest it has been since the siege, and the best equipped it has been since Gilliman left. Those two things are both true, and the tension between them is the entire current era of the setting. The 5 entries on this list don't resolve that tension. They define the terms of it. They tell you what has historically been required when the math doesn't work and the walls are failing. And the institution that was supposed to handle this has demonstrated it. Cannot. The answer has never been the institution. It has always been the person standing in front of it, who decided this was not where it ended. That person has never been inevitable, has never been guaranteed to arrive in time, has always, somehow, arrived anyway. The Imperium is 10,000 years of somehow. That is either the most terrifying or the most reassuring thing about it, depending on what you think the odds are of somehow continuing to work indefinitely. If you want more of this, not just what happened, but what it means, where the cracks are, what the victories actually cost, subscribe. The algorithm rewards engagement, which is a smaller version of the same logic as every entry on this list. Someone has to be the reason the thing keeps going. Like the video if you think it deserves to reach people who'd care about it. Next video is about the Night Lords, specifically whether Conrad Kurz's terror tactics were a legitimate doctrine of war, or whether the Night Haunter was a broken man who found a military framework that made his brokenness feel like purpose. Sanguinius saw his death in visions and chose to face it head-on, chose to make it mean something, chose to be the reason the moment didn't end in the worst possible way. Kurz saw his death in visions too. He chose something completely different. Something that looked like nihilism to some people and looked like honesty to others, depending on what you think the purpose of a Space Marine Legion actually is. That difference is the entire argument about what the Night Lords were and what they meant, and it has not been resolved in 10,000 years of argument about it. The video goes deeper than most Night Lords coverage is willing to go, because the easy answer is wrong. For the Emperor, because in 10,000 years, it has always come down to someone deciding that matters enough to act on it. Every single time.